Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Put Your People First, Building Organizational Safety and Resiliency webinar. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to join the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, it seems like we have a good group who has joined. We'll let everyone kind of join the webinar as we get started here. Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Leslie Garza. I'm on the brand and communications team here at Pariveda Solutions, and we're excited today to engage in a discussion with two great minds on a topic of deep importance for companies today and what we're dealing with. This discussion is centered around a co-authored white paper, Put Your People First, Building Organizational Safety and Resiliency. For Q&A today that we'll do at the end of the discussion, please submit your questions in the Q&A forum in this webinar. If we can answer them live, we will try to do so, and if not, we will ask them at the end to Carrie and Steve. After this webinar, this presentation and recording will be sent to you via email and also available on the Pariveda Solutions public website. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists today. Today we have Stephen Wunker. He is the Managing Director of New Markets Advisor. He's the author of 3 books, including Capturing New Markets, How Smart Companies Create Opportunities Others Don't, Jobs to Be Done, A Roadmap for Customer-Centered Innovation, and Costivation, innovation that gives your customers exactly what they want and nothing more. He has led New Markets Advisors since 2009. In that capacity, he publishes frequently in outlets such as Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and the Financial Times. He's also appeared over the years on Bloomberg and BBC television, and he has been a guest lecturer at institutions such as Dartmouth's Tuck School of Business. Steve has an MBA from Harvard Business School, a Master's of Public Administration from Columbia University, and a BA cum laude from Princeton University. Also, we have Carrie Stover here with us today. He has over 3 decades of management and technology consulting experience in developing and implementing business strategies enabled by leading technology. With expertise in defining and implementing the strategy, organization, people, process, and technology required to execute meaningful business change, he has specific experience in co-creating value in his clients and companies through his career. Much of Carrie's experience comes from the variety of leadership positions he has held in his 20-year career as a partner with Accenture. He has a passion for growing people and helping customers create resilient, sustainable, scalable organizations by pursuing a people-centric purpose. Carrie graduated from Baylor University in 1979 with a BS in mathematics with honors. Carrie and Steve, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks.
Good to have you both here. So I want to start off this discussion with you both, and Steve, we'll start with you around why this topic is a topic of importance and why you decided it was necessary to write something on it.
Yeah, good question. We specialize in new markets, like the name of the company would suggest, and we're often thinking about the future and scenarios about the future. And we've certainly been working with clients on their strategic positioning around the pandemic and what comes afterwards. But we've also had clients approach us fairly recently saying, that's great, but I also have this really immediate to figure out, what are we going to do with our employees? What are we going to do with this office space? Why do we resume here versus virtually? Is there a playbook, or are there a set of playbooks? And we realized that our sort of specialization in scenario-based analysis really applies to what a lot of companies are dealing with today. So we've known you folks at Pariveda for quite a while. We figured this would be an ideal partnership to put out something from both of us that applies that sort of logic.
That's great. Carrie?
And at Paribeta, we've been a people-centric company since our founding, our purpose to develop people to their fullest potential. We've been very concerned about the people that we work with, our employees and our clients, about how companies navigate the pandemic. And as it came to decision making, one of the things that we have operated with is an open governance system that really strives to create accountabilities and make them public for people to see. One of the things that crossed our mind was, who holds the accountability for deciding when people can come into work? For example, you have a safety organization in many companies, and they decide about specific plants and what it means to come in, but very few say who has the overall authority to make a company-wide decision about a global pandemic, about who should or should not be able to come into work. And so that created a vacuum that we felt not only in our company, but we sort of realized that was going to exist in many companies. And we worked with Steve in the past, and we're excited to team with him on how do we approach this and what guidance could we give our clients through the scenario-based approaches.
That's a great point, Gary. And that kind of leads us into what really is a center point in the white paper, and something that you go into length describing are these three scenarios that you talk about, kind of scenario 1, 2, and 3 on how this recovery can really go forward. So I want to kind of move into scenario 1 and talk about this idea of the W-shaped recovery. Do you feel like that's where we are at with now? And what could contingency plans look like with a W-shaped recovery? And Carrie, we can start with you.
Sure. Now, I'm in Dallas, Texas, and Dallas has been one of those that has been a little less rigorous in its lockdown processes. And there's an amount of returning to work that fits scenario 1, quite frankly, we don't have large-scale testing yet. We've got larger-scale testing, and certainly traceability contacts is still in its infancy here. Contracts are just being let out by the government to expand that significantly. And so there's a big question in our clients' minds about when should they be able to return? What should they do? And as Steve mentioned earlier, what do you do with your work and with your workplace in order to be successful in having people back in a different role, or where should they be? So we're seeing that with companies having moved into remote work, having done so successfully, but now they're trying to think through how much should I go back? What should I do during this period of time? One example locally is Very, which makes the Very desk components, the stand-up desks that many of us are used to seeing. As an office design company, they're trying to figure out how do they engineer products and make recommendations that would create the right social distancing to fit the capacity that people are allowed to bring back to work at this point in time. And they are one of the first movers in the Dallas area in large-scale companies to bring employees back, into the workplace in a way that creates safety and, in their case, leverages the ability to use their products. It's been interesting to see, and they've got some innovation, but it does challenge how much should they re-engineer the workplace? How much should they invest in it at this period of time when we're not sure what kind of recovery we're really getting?
For sure. Steve, are you seeing anything in scenario 1 with your clients right now?
Yeah, we are, and it really depends where they are. So we're based in Boston, and Boston has taken a more cautious approach to reopening, although things are definitely moving in that direction. But if we look globally, we have clients in Singapore that did pretty well with the first wave of the virus, and then they reopened, and the virus really came back with vengeance. And so now they've had to get a little bit more strict. And as we were writing the paper, this was happening, and as I wrote to Carrie, I believe, look, Singapore does these things pretty well, right? So let us not presume that we're going to be more efficient or effective than Singapore. And if they've had ups and downs, then we probably are going to as well. And so that's why we called it a W-shaped recovery. There's not going to be any single direction of this curve. It's going to have some points of inflection. And those might vary depending upon where you are in the country or where you are globally as well.
Definitely, and that kind of leads us into scenario 2 around this idea of acceptable treatments, right? Where it's not necessarily W anymore. It goes in more of a normal curve. with the introduction of these treatments. Steve, what are your thoughts on scenario 2 in bringing people back to work?
So I think then you really need to think about your workforce, but in terms of, and the composition of the workforce, I should say. But in terms of what we mean by scenario two, let's look at the existing treatment out there now with remdesivir, which is a so-so sort of therapy. There's certainly evidence that it's helpful. It's not a silver bullet. And if you look at how a lot of antiviral therapies have run their course, they are typically agglomerated up over time into cocktails. The single great solve can take quite a while. And instead, you just get something that is gradually more effective for gradually broader sets of the population. And as that happens, then I think companies need to look at their workforces and say, well, who is really at risk here? And if we can minimize the risk for people who are already fairly healthy and in low risk groups, then perhaps that's acceptable, whereas people who might be more endangered might really not be appropriate to bring back to work. These are the sort of distinctions that I think very few companies would have felt comfortable doing prior to March of this year. And yet this is just pragmatically what they have to do to keep people's jobs and to continue to operate, but be responsible with respect to their employees. You see on the y-axis of this grid here, a handful of questions that we think companies should be asking. Only part of it is how fast do you return to work, but it's also about the re-engineering of the workplaces. How much do you transform the way you do work? And then, finally, how intrusive are you going to be with respect to people's health status? And the answers to that really do differ between scenario 1 and 2. With scenario 2, if you're already bringing back a fairly low risk population, and medically we've been able to reduce their risk even further, then the extent of re-engineering and work transformation, might be a little bit less. But on the flip side, there is a need to be fairly intrusive to determine what the risk really is for people.
Definitely. And Carrie, would love to hear your thoughts on if scenario 1 and scenario 2 combine in any way.
I think that the introduction of treatments will not be widespread overnight. There's still testing, there's still production that has to occur, wide-scale production. And so it's going to be a combination for a period of time where people feel that there is something coming and more risk is taken in scenario 1, and maybe it doesn't work out, and then we have a lapse seen in Singapore. So I think we'll be going through the waves of a W, not just one single W, but more like an oscillation wave, as acceptable treatments eventually come into play. One of the key things that management has to do in this process, and it's said in scenario 1 in the bottom, but it applies to all of them, is, are you going to enforce holding people accountable for the rules that you put in place for workplace behavior, workplace safety? So if someone comes in with a fever, are you going to send them home? Is that normally part of your culture? Can you enforce it? The kind of age discrimination that's going to feel like it's there when you're questioning someone who's 55 or older, whether they should be in the office, are things, as Steve mentioned, we wouldn't have considered before March of this year. But now it's an open discussion, and I think both sides are very open to the safety needs of individuals more so than the feeling of discrimination. I do think there is a coming wave around treatments, and it'll get play more into scenario 3 about the traceability and the need for people's records to be widely available, to be shared as you go into new environments.
Definitely, and that leads us into a good point on just how our organization's preparing now for scenario 3. What makes sense to ensure safety as we go into that scenario 3? So Carrie, thoughts on what organizations should be doing now to prepare for that?
There is, in my mind, I think there's a continuum that we move through, scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3. I think we are still really focused on scenario 1 with scenario 2 emerging. And I think scenario 3 is a bit further away with a very low percentage of the population actually having immunity at this point, or an unknown, I guess is the best way to say it, percentage of the population having it. So the ideas of at-risk workers and isolation is still critical in this. I think that when you're thinking of the workforce, it is easier and grocery stores did this virtually overnight, it felt like, to put in plastic shields to protect their workers at the checkout stands, et cetera. Many companies will move to putting in shields to decrease the openness of offices and create safety between cubicles. So there's some aspects that I think will start to come in as people realize we should be able to engineer a workforce, a workspace that is safe enough for individuals. And as we get greater immunity that starts building, we will be able to carefully isolate individuals and to put people in a less, not germ-free, but an environment where it slows down the movement of the virus through the workplace. But you do get to that intrusion of, will people need to carry a passport with them to prove that they are? There are buildings that are starting to enforce, for companies in a high rise, their ability to check temperatures. And if you can't pass a temperature check at the front door, you don't get into the building at all. That's not a corporate standard. That's now actually the building taking care of something for companies. And that's going to be another part of the change in social behavior that people are going to have to get used to until we have scenario 3 emerge.
Definitely, and I've seen that in doctors' offices and even restaurants here in Texas, is checking at the door to see that you have no fever. Steve, for scenario 3, how are you talking to your clients about this idea of safety?
I think this plays out in 2 potential ways for scenario 3. The one way, the way we hope we don't see, is when we get some degree of herd immunity, just because so many of us have been exposed over the months and months that we have run the risk. Already in Boston, there was a random test a couple of weeks ago, and 10% of the people tested had COVID antibodies. So this is happening gradually, unfortunately, with bad consequences. What another potential route here, though, is that we have emerged some vaccines which are safe, at least for a portion of the population, and they are somewhat effective. So they are not the wonder vaccine that resolves these situations in the movies, but it's more how these things really happen. So we hope that it is broadly safe, but it may not be for certain at-risk populations. And if the efficacy is enough to substantially reduce the risk of both contracting the disease or how the disease might actually play out in the body if you do come down with it, then as with scenario 2, there might be segments of the population that are low risk enough to bring back to work. And then the corollary of that is, if that happens, what happens to consumer and other customer behavior? Are they going to be expecting that more people are at work with them? Are they going to expect fewer safeguards to be in place? And how are companies going to push back against that? I think our impulse now is to think that companies are going to err on the side of caution, and we would certainly recommend that. I'm not sure if that's universally going to happen. So we'll have to see how that push and pull plays out. And equally, if the people who are deemed to be at lower risk start engaging in what would now be seen as very risky behaviors, is that going to cancel out some of the benefit that's going to be achieved? So however you play this, there is likely going to be a group of people that's going to be more immune, and that enables at least some resumption of operations. The tricky thing is going to be, are those the people who you would prioritize to bring back to the workplace? Or how are you going to share work or redivide responsibilities? The people who you can bring back are really the people you most want to bring back.
And I think you bring up a good point about customers versus bringing back employees, right? How are companies thinking about their customers and the customer interactions in the stores? Carrie, any thoughts on how companies should shift that mindset to take that same safety lens to their customers as well?
It's been interesting to see it evolve. I think the first wave was employees, as it should be for companies, but the social distancing, the traffic patterns through grocery stores, et cetera, have all been now put in place. You see that now in pretty much anywhere you go, even the ability to enter a store with safety, social distancing. So as to Steve's point earlier, I think there will be, as wider immunity happens, it's going to be harder for people to believe the social distancing rules still apply for themselves. There's a large segment of our population that doesn't like a lot of rules, and they're going to be, they're fighting now with masks. I can see that a challenge in scenario 3 is for the resolve of the American people and people across the world to hold to the things that would create safety for customers in these businesses between each other, more so than customers to employees. It's really the customer interaction that is the widest spread possibilities in these.
Definitely. And that brings us to kind of the 2 points that you anchor on really in the entire white paper, is this idea of safety and this idea of resiliency and how that plays across not only those scenarios, but some stories as well, what people are doing to kind of ensure this. Why were those the two, and Steve, we can start with you, that really gave you the idea to center this paper around it? Why were those two things the most important in your mind?
Well, look, safety is an obvious one. It's what is paramount in people's minds right now. But there are different ways to think about safety. Is it the short-term things, or are we going to be re-architecting the workplace, preparing for potentially a long-term pandemic when we just don't know if those outcomes can be achieved in the time frame that we're still going to be worried about the disease? And then how are you going to enforce the rules that you have? Is it all going to be very top-down after we've been trying to empower people? Is it going to be a very rules-based culture again? So people are grappling with that, but I think equally some of the more forward-thinking companies have been saying, well, let's assume that this could get bad, or at least could get bad in certain localities where we have a high degree of dependence. How are we going to be resilient against those disasters? We interviewed a couple organizations in Puerto Rico, and we asked, what were the lessons that you learned from Hurricane Maria? And how have you carried that forward to be more resilient now? And it certainly did bake into a lot of operations, just how you should have certain redundancy and ability to withstand shocks. And I think they've been able to handle things pretty well as a result when the pandemic came around. But how do we generalize those principles and apply that across a very wide variety of organizations? That's what we've tried to do in the resiliency portion of this paper.
Carrie, your thoughts on this idea of resiliency and safety?
The safety, as Steve said, is paramount to success. Without employees or customers, a company is nothing. And so you need them and you need to have them safe, and you're not going to engage them unless a customer in particular feels safe, or an employee to show up for work feels safe. So what can you do to create that feeling of safety? And also it's an acceleration of what's been a decades-long trend to the idea of digitization, of getting rid of paper, of getting processes that are streamlined. This is a greater accelerant to that need, to eliminate the need of an office, if you will, that centers around paper concepts. And that's going to be critical in not just the time for this pandemic, but we're starting to see that these pandemics are coming at some greater frequency. And so how do you prepare for the next one after this? And from a resiliency, I think this is proven to show the fragility of supply chains, the one-dimensional nature of looking for the lowest cost resource and doing 100% of your sourcing from that. From internally trying to have the most efficient operation by single sourcing and routing and having specialists do individual work, versus trying to create an effective organization that can bend and adapt as needed. I think the pandemic has shown that organizations are going to need to work differently. I think anybody who's worked from home has found things are getting done differently. And it can't be the hierarchy that all decisions need to flow to the top. In this world where there are so many unknowns, whether we call this chaos, which it might have felt like back in March, or at least complicated, which we certainly are complex, as we would say right now. People need to be able to make decisions at the moment that they face an issue. And so getting decision-making distributed to the lowest level of the organization, the point where a customer meets an employee, is extremely critical. And because right now there aren't many right answers when you think about how to navigate the future. Every right answer is really an assimilation of a lot of small right answers between a customer and an employee. And if your employees are empowered to make them, your organization is going to be much more successful during this time.
Definitely. And you both bring up a good point around this idea of lessons learned and how we're already looking and seeing lessons that have come even from March. And to your point, Steve, earlier about your client, that they're seeing lessons learned come out of this from previous crisis in their countries. So with that, I want to move into the Q&A portion of this. We've got some great questions lined up for you both. And I'll just kind of read them kind of off the top. They're coming in anonymously, but we'll start with the first one. And Stephen, I think this will be a good one for you. This person asks, how can my industry, which is in the high-tech area, think about a worker and guest safety as we've talked about this, as we're in mostly open office spaces today. So how should we think about that open office concept in the tech area?
Look, I think you have to be very conservative with that. We serve a lot of tech clients, and we as consultants are not being invited back in. Right, the company just has less control over visitors than it does its own staff. But I know that even for the areas that they have, they are taking it very, very slow. Now, look, I get that there are some elements of tech where being co-located is very, very important. Like hardware design, for instance. You have to sort of see things and talk things through. But the open plan does not lend itself to that. To the extent that we have seen people do this, we've seen people create shifts, also just in designated times to enter and leave the building so that they don't congregate at choke points. The shifts, by the way, to just isolate different groups of people so that if shift A starts getting a rise in disease, shift B is somewhat isolated. We see this with schools as well, right? Schools are the original open plan office. And we see a lot of people struggling now. I'm working with my kids' school on their plans to reopen. And it is challenging, and they're going to be doing it in stages to see how effective their containment plans really are.
Definitely. And Carrie, at Parveda, we have the open concept in most of our office spaces today. So what are your thoughts around this kind of open idea for guests and workers?
I follow Steve's thoughts and just say that in addition to it, the guests are pretty much a given, that you can't really control who comes in. And you really want to be responsible for a guest and getting the virus from one of your employees when they're there. Second, conference rooms. Conference rooms need to be thrown away in this time. Getting 5 or 6 people in a room for an hour. All the studies show that this isn't something that's passed along because you talk to someone one time as you pass them in the hallway. It comes from being in close quarters where mouths are open, water vapor is coming out of the mouths, out of the lungs, into the air and floating around. So masks are then required. And I know many companies do not want to be in a world with masks. But a conference room without masks is one of the worst places a person should be if you're trying to avoid catching this virus in an open workforce. So I think many tech companies thrive on having conference rooms, which are huddle rooms to used to. And I think those have to be done away with and do virtual, even if you're in the same building with somebody, just so you can have your protected workspace, whether it's a cube or an office, that at least you can control to a degree the quality of of your workstation.
Definitely. And that kind of goes into this next question. We've talked a lot about just, companies as a general. This question centers really around industries. And the person is asking, what industries do you think are really ahead in thinking through safety especially as we reemerge at some point in the new normal. So Carol, we can start with you. What industries are you seeing really lead the way?
Yeah, the ones who are prepared for it most have been like the high-tech industries, which have had, you know, industrial manufacturings of highly sensitive equipment that needed pure air, hazmat type suits, recording of individuals' movements, et cetera. So they understood that. So they've got the knowledge and wherewithal from their own operational capabilities to bring that back into the organizations. And you're seeing that flow into other high-tech manufacturing environments as well. Additionally, then I think it's been harder because of the pressing efforts, but hospitals have been in the world of tracing where people go and where viruses connect through. They are, restaurants, quite frankly, are one of the most tested environments with, food checkers coming around from local city governments testing the quality of things. They have responded rapidly, many of these small local businesses trying to survive in a way of trying to build out a new model of operating in a world where you can't have people come into your business. And I think they've adapted well with curbside service in a way that many companies are thinking of redesigning their future businesses so that that takes a greater portion of the business than having people sit in dining rooms for a period of time. Steve, others
sorry, Gary, go ahead.
Steve, others that you can think of?
I'll add a business that probably many of us haven't experienced that much all that recently, which is hotels. Hotels were really rapid to get the furniture out of their lobbies, to institute protocols for spacing of guests, to make sure that staff don't come into close contact, to change how they're cleaning their rooms. It's a very process-driven industry in hotels, and they think in a very systematic way about customer experience. It is often not that fast-moving, but in this case, it certainly was. They were able to turn those disciplines to really quick effect. If you stayed in a hotel recently, you'll see it's a very different experience. They're still trying to give you hospitality, but they've really rethought the whole path in and out from your room.
Yeah, I haven't been to one yet, but that's interesting to see. And one industry you touched on earlier, Carrie, was around food products. Mm-hmm. And this question from one of our attendees says, our company creates food products distributed widely in North America. How can we ensure our customers feel we've done all that we can do to keep them safe? So back to that customer thought. And Steve, we can start with you on that one and hear your thoughts.
Right. So, that's a tough one because, of course, the actual risk of transmitting this disease from food is very, very low. It's not really how it spreads. But, you may already have things like an NSF seal for, certifying other aspects of what you do. And playing up those certifications might be a way to put people's minds at rest that some third party has come in and verified your protocols. Of course, it's an added expense, but it is a fairly quick thing to turn on. And I would think that third-party validation, more than 100 companies all saying we're safe, is a way to stand out a little bit from the crowd.
And I'll offer, in support of that, transparency is critical for any company wanting to have its customers feel that their product or their service is safe. To not just, as Steve said, say it, but to validate it. So one of the things that's not quite in the food processing industry, but in the food distribution business, double sealing packages so that you see that the package that was manufactured is now sealed inside of another package as it's put ready for distribution, so that it limits the amount of contact on the inside package and exposure. Now, again, these are not high levels of transmission, but we're talking about a mindset of safety that people need to feel from your company. And I fully endorse the idea of third-party validation because it does go to the concept of transparency where you feel safe when someone else is validating the processes of the company.
There are signals you can send. I wrote in Forbes this week about an auto body shop, that's trying to use the pandemic as an opportunity to go on offense and seize market share. Sadly, I was in this auto body shop because even with no traffic, I got into an accident. I saw that the body shop had wrapped my steering wheel in plastic. And so I had the owner there and I was asking, well, why are you doing that? And he said, look, really, I don't know if this reduces the transmission of disease or not, but it's a signal to show that we care, that we're looking out for things. We're trying to be proactive. And that I thought was really smart. So in your business, whatever it might be, what are those signals that you can send that you are really thinking about this? And then hopefully people will consider that's not just the steering wheel you're taking care of, but a lot of other unseen things as well.
Yeah, it's a really great story. It goes kind of into this next question around consumer behavior. In this idea of, from this attendee, they asked, do you think consumer behavior will be impacted for the long term from the pandemic? If so, how? And we've already seen it be impacted from the pandemic, but to your point, changing that safety piece of it to kind of drive even more consumer behavior. Carrie, we can start with you on this one. Just how will we continue to see consumer behavior evolve?
The increase in e-commerce is going to be a permanent step up, not maybe to the level it is, but certainly it'll continue the direction it's gone for. Also, curbside takeout is going to continue to increase. I think people are going to have a long time feeling safe for years of sitting in restaurants, crowded restaurants again. And there's an experience of getting closeness that consumers are getting. I cannot tell you how many colleagues and in my network that I've spoken with who have talked about the time at home. Yeah, they're tired of being at home and working at home, but the increased closeness to family, the joy of having a meal prepared that they'd forgotten about, the idea of casual get-togethers in a socially distant way in the backyard with other friends, those things have taken a greater sense of purpose in people's lives than before. And so I think the combination of concern for safety as well as the pleasure that people are finding from some new ways of dining, for example, is there. And I think people have many have gotten over the hump of, should I use Instacart or no? Should I use Jet or no? All those things. Walmart has grown much faster, even at their size in their takeout business or their business, because people can go get what they want within a couple of hours of ordering it. And it's hitting Amazon at this point of e-commerce, but e-commerce with flexibility. And I think that's one of the things that will emerge out of this, is that it's not just getting something delivered to your doorstep, but it's getting it the way you'd like to get it that's going to emerge out of this, this change in behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have a working paper on this topic, and I summarized it in a Forbes article a couple of weeks ago. I think it's something like, after COVID, what behavior changes will stick. And we laid out 6 tests to sort of indicate whether something is going to stick around or not. It's often not the innate appeal of an idea that determines how quickly or slowly it gets taken up. I wrote actually my first book years ago about indoor plumbing, which is a great idea. And it took 4,500 years from its invention to its broad adoption. So it's not about the quality of the idea. It's about other factors that impede take-up, that create inertia. And the thing about the pandemic is that it has been the great inertia breaker. So, all the things that have sort of ossified structures into place have now been shattered, and they will recongeal, but they may congeal around different sorts of behaviors. In the Forbes piece, I used the example of medtech sales. So, typically medtech sales, people are highly compensated. They are frequently in an operating room or when a procedure is being done, and they are very hands-on in what gets done. But now they can't be. The hospitals are restricting their presence. And what we see is that the medtech companies we work with are actually really welcoming this, because it significantly lowers their costs. And everybody has wanted to break from this model, but nobody felt that they could be first, because the competitors would just elbow them aside and force them out. And so now that everybody's done it, nobody wants to be the first back in there. And moreover, all the inertia factors that impeded the change in the first place are now impeding a change back. So you have all the committees that would have to meet again and say, oh, we want these people back in the operating room. That is not likely to happen anytime soon. So behavior changes like that are going to stick. And then there are other sorts of behavior changes that probably would have been appealing a long time ago, but we just hadn't experimented and known about them. The favorite one I use, although the subject of this example would kill me if he knew I was using it, is my 7th grade son, who loves virtual learning because he has all the educational benefits, but he doesn't have to deal with the social anxieties of 7th grade. There is no sitting at the virtual lunch table. And so now that he's actually experienced this, he very much welcomes that. I think those sorts of behaviors as well are going to stick around.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty funny too, because in 7th grade, you do have social anxiety, right? You don't want to go. There's some days you don't want to go to school just for that reason. I think we have time for one more question. I'll ask from one of our attendees. And it's really on how, from a long-term perspective, should companies and individuals accept these kind of new requirements? Is there going to be a new normal, or should we kind of take it day by day? Or how are companies really thinking about it with respect to, the fever checking and the keeping 6 feet apart? Should we go back to a normal or no?
So look, I don't think we're going to be going back to how things were for quite some time, right? Even once we have vaccines, until they've really been rolled out and we know that they're effective and we have some experience with it and comfort with it, I suspect that these restrictions are going to be lifted quite slowly. In actual practice, I imagine that people's attitudes are going to flex depending upon where we are in the pandemic. And you can't just say, we'll totally take that day by day, unless you're in a sort of industry that allows you the flexibility to do that. That's wonderful. A lot of us do have to plan, but we advocate not just having one plan, but have a few that correspond to these scenarios. And that applies to bringing your people back to work, but it also applies to the customer experience that you provide. Think through those scenarios, think about what's really going to be important to your employees and your customers in those scenarios, and then be able to execute those plans pretty quickly, perhaps because you've already prototyped them, you've gotten out the operational bugs, and when the situation hits, you're ready to go.
From a long-term perspective, there's been some studies showing the number of companies whose business operations have not been dramatically affected by COVID-19. And in those companies, there's transactions that are largely happening virtually, financial industries, insurance, et cetera. They're not as affected by this because the customer-employee customers are not aggregated in a place. Employees don't need to be aggregated as much. But if you're in an industry that, outdoor productions, for example, you used to go to a rock concert and you wouldn't have to have your bag checked for a bomb before you went in, but now you've got to have a clear plastic bag. They have to be able to see inside of it. Adding temperature checking is probably not going to bother individuals that much from a safety perspective, and people are going to feel better about it. Same thing for getting into a bus or into an airplane. It's additive to the large changes that people have already gone through. And so to some, it'll feel like an extra, but to most, it's going to feel more like a safety measure that I'm being looked out for by the government if it's chosen to be done at the TSA level or at the individual airlines that are taking me.
Well, thank you both. We are at time. I appreciate your insight, your thoughts. I want to remind everybody that this recording will be on the Parveda Solutions website, as well as sent out to all the people who registered if they were not able to make it, or if you want to watch it again. The white paper is available online. It goes into a lot more depth than we were able to cover today. And if you need to get in touch with Parveda or New Markets Advisors or Carrie or Steve, the information is there below for you. I appreciate everyone jumping on, listening to our discussion. Carrie, Steve, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Steve.
And we will talk soon. Thanks, guys.